Welcome back to another lesson with me, Mr. B. In this video, we're going to take our first look at the book Internment by Samira Ahmed. For the next few lessons, our assignments will be structured relatively the same. For the assigned reading, you'll be given a prompt or question to find an example of the instructions in that prompt or question in the story. So as you can see on the unit tracker over here, we're going to zoom in really quick. For these first few chapters, you're going to be asked to choose an eye of oppression and analyze the story. Later down the line, when we get to chapters 7 through 11, you're going to be asked to choose one of the pedagogy of the oppressed concepts, or just find one of them, and write a response on Google Classroom. And then as we get from chapters 12 through 20, you're going to choose one of the literary theories that we learned about. So like the historical lens or the critical race lens, feminist gender sexuality lens. You're going to look at one of those literary theories and find them in one of these chapters to include in your response on Google Classroom. Chapter 1 provides a lot of context about the setting of the story and our protagonist, 17-year-old Layla Amin. So on the first page of the book, Layla informs us of the book burning that's happening in town. And then over on page 2, we get a timeline of the events that led up to this book burning. And Layla describes it as there is only what we once were and what we have become. And it's kind of similar to the world that we live in now, where it's pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. And in this case, it's pre-Muslim ban, post-Muslim ban. And so on page 2, we see this section where she talks about it's been 2.5 years since the election, 2 years since the Nazis marched on DC, 18 months since the Muslim ban, 1 year since our answers on the census landed us on the registry, 9 months since the first book burning, 6 months since the exclusion laws were enacted, 5 months since Korematsu v. United States established precedent for relocation, 3 months since they started firing Muslims from public sector jobs, 2 months since an Islamophobe was sworn in as the Secretary of War, a position that hasn't existed since World War II, and then 1 month since the President of the US televised a speech to the Congress declaring that Muslims are a threat to America. So this gives us a little timetable of what's been going on, and we can make some predictions of what's going to happen, or make connections back to this timeline that Layla has given us. One of the things that we're going to see coming up in the next couple chapters is this firing of Muslims from public sector jobs. So if it wasn't obvious from the previous lessons on Newsella, Layla has been dealing with Islamophobia turned into a Muslim ban, justified by the Supreme Court case Korematsu v. United States. And as some of you have mentioned in class, if you recall from US history or APUSH, the Supreme Court held that relocation of American citizens of Japanese descent was constitutional. And in this case, this Supreme Court case was brought back up to establish precedent of relocation of citizens during times of war. So let's think back to our anticipation guide discussion. One of the statements is this passage right here: Muslims are a threat to America. So we're going to take a look at how that phrasing of Muslims are a threat to America takes effect in the interactions that Layla has with some of the characters. So one of the people that she runs into, a familiar face, which is known as Mrs. Brown, Layla bumps into her, and then the Mrs. Brown just drops everything that she's holding. We see the fear and Islamophobia present in Mrs. Brown because Layla just moments before this describes that there is a flyer hanging around for the book burning, saying to join your neighbors in a list of banned books. And one of the things that Mrs. Brown is holding is Nameless Saints by Ali Amin, which is Layla's father. And she also has one of the flyers that fall to the ground when they bump into each other. And we also see fear freedom in Mrs. Brown. After bumping into Layla, she could have said something, but instead she kind of opens her mouth and then shuts it and pushes past Layla. She doesn't even address her. Flyer for the book burning, she kind of just leaves it and heads off in that direction. So why I say this is an example of fear freedom is that Mrs. Brown, instead of speaking up or even standing up for Layla and her family, instead she's kind of silent to be compliant. And though this might be more so an example of showing the two sides of Mrs. Brown and maybe an example of others in Layla's small town, we get another sense of the fear freedom in the next couple pages where we meet Layla's boyfriend, David. He addresses how his parents have reacted to this Muslim ban. So over on page 11 of the book, David addresses that his dad is being a total asshole and my mom is going along with him. I think she's too terrified to speak up. And so that being too terrified to speak up, they feel safer that they're not a part of the Muslim ban or that they don't have to speak up. They don't want to be involved with it. And in not speaking up, David's family is contributing to the Islamophobia. And so by the end of chapter 1, we get a good understanding of David and Layla's relationship. They were longtime friends before getting together, and now they have a strong, intimate relationship. But we see that David sends Layla off for her own safety because they almost get caught for Layla being out after curfew. So there's a lot going on in this chapter, kind of setting the scene. And as I mentioned earlier, there are several examples of oppression in this chapter: institutional, interpersonal, connected to systemic racism and Islamophobia. Again, when we talked about Mrs. Brown or David's family, the book burning, and one section that I didn't necessarily cover yet that I wanted to highlight was this part about the president's speech, where there's this televised announcement on the airwaves, if you will. It says, "One people, one nation, tune in at 9 p.m. for the president's national security address to be broadcast on all channels." And it's become something that's a weekly speech for everyone to pay attention to, probably spreading more propaganda around the Muslim ban and exclusionary acts that have been put in place. So to reiterate again, there's fear of freedom present in Mrs. Brown's actions, not wanting to speak up, in David's mother and her compliance being the silence, essentially. She's too terrified to speak up. So there are definitely more examples of oppression or pedagogy oppressed concepts that we could look for. We could have even looked at this chapter through the historical theory or the critical race theory. And now what I want you to do is take your stab at trying to find a form of oppression in this chapter. If you haven't already, read through chapter 1 and find some examples that show one of the eyes of oppression present. Again, like I mentioned, there's definitely forms of institutional oppression with the present, forms of interpersonal oppression between Layla and Mrs. Brown, and other systemic things that are going on with David's family. And I hope this was helpful for you to find an example of your own. On Google Classroom, remember that we did take some notes in class, so you can refer to those to help facilitate your answer. Thanks for tuning in to another lesson with me, Mr. B, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.